Welcome to Curiosity Cake, the podcast about ideas for curious minds with big appetites. I'm your host, Lee Delaney. On this episode, I'm talking vigilantes with anthropologist and comic book fan Gavin Weston of Goldsmiths, University, London. Gavin's main area of interest is the anthropology of violence and vigilantism and explores the intersections between anthropology, popular culture, and violence. Gavin's latest book, Anthropological Controversies, The Crimes and Misdemeanors That Shaped the Discipline, explores the history of anthropology through controversies within the subject. Do subscribe, rate, and review the show on your podcast app. Reviews really help the show get seen by search algorithms. But for now, get yourself a cup of tea, grab a fork, and dig into a slice of curiosity cake. Curiosity Cake. Gavin, welcome to Curiosity Cake. It's good to have you. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
So, Gavin, you study vigilantes. That's a particular topic of interest for yourself, but you put a really interesting slant on that that's drawn from a personal interest. Can you tell us about that?
So I came to vigilantes in the early 2000s with my PhD research. So as an anthropologist who was interested in human rights and violence, I ended up looking at Guatemalan vigilantism. So in the immediate aftermath of the Guatemalan Civil War, which saw sort of 36 years of protracted violence, including the genocide against the Mayan people, as soon as that civil war came to an end, there was an outbreak of vigilantism that swept across the country. They referred to it as lynchings. It's not lynchings in the sense that you find in the United States, although they did borrow the same term, but it was communities taking justice into their own hands. So against a backdrop of declining fear of the militarized state as they turned towards a civil police force, but also against a backdrop of rising crime, rising dissatisfaction, and all of these other things happening simultaneously, this wave of lynching spread across the country as different communities took issue with the deficiencies in state policing, the absence of justice, and they took justice into their own hands. So that's where I came into looking at vigilantism. But over the subsequent 2 decades, I've been increasingly interested in lots of other aspects of vigilantism, particularly how vigilantism spreads and the relationship between vigilantism and the media. So the history behind the way in which vigilantism can be spread and exacerbated through the media, the way in which vigilantism is represented in the media. These are all things that I also have spent time thinking about as well. But it all started with this original research on Guatemalan lynchings.
What drew you to Guatemala in particular?
Oh, so that was just a series of intersecting sort of happy accidents. Is it happy, really?
It's not the word that comes to mind when you think
No.
of a 36-year civil war.
No, not at all. Predominantly, it was an area I was reading a lot about because I was being taught at the time by Richard Wilson. So Richard Wilson had done research in Guatemala looking at the conflict in Guatemala, but also the way in which Mayan resistance sort of effervesced in the sort of later stages of the Civil War. And it was his classes on political anthropology and human rights that really made me want to study human rights and violence as a subject. And because I wanted to be supervised by him, it made sense to be looking at that particular area. But because he also did research on South Africa, if I wanted to be supervised by him, I was looking at both regions, looking for something that was as yet unresearched. And as I was starting to look for something that sort of dealt with something new in regards to human rights, this new wave of lynchings was really coming to a peak. And at that stage, the UN mission in Guatemala, they referred to this as being a new form of human rights abuse. And it was at that moment that I thought, okay, this is a subject that's under-researched. It's being described as being a human rights issue and a new form of human rights issue. And this is something where I can go there and say something meaningful. And so that's what drew me to it originally, was like in the search for something where there was a human rights issue, but one where there was something that needed teasing out. And so that's what I wanted to explore, was how lynchings emerged, but looking at like the macrocosm and the microcosm simultaneously. How do individual lynchings arise, but also how does a wider phenomenon of vigilantism take control? Well, not take control, but come about at the level of the state, like a national phenomenon, and trying to reconcile those two things, the sort of microcosm of a lynching and the macrocosm of a wave of lynchings at the same time.
And that word lynching has real connotations, like you say, linked to the US, and how lynching was used there. So, are there similar racial elements in Guatemala?
No, so they did borrow the term, but it was in the absence of there being another term to describe the phenomenon that was going on. So in Guatemala, it's referred to as linchamientos. Um, Linchamientos just translate literally as lynchings. So you'll see the same thing going on in many other countries around the world at the moment, that when there's an outbreak of vigilantism, it tends to be referred to as lynchings, but there's not always that same racialized element. So the reasons why it happens in Guatemala are primarily about issues of uh, perceived criminality, perceived injustice, and the need to police it. So that's what a lynching is in the case of Guatemala, rather than having these racialized elements. It's not to say that there's never racialized elements, it's just that the word itself doesn't inherently indicate that that's the sort of motivating factor.
So, primarily there in Guatemala, the vigilantism wasn't perpetrated due to racial issues, it was wider societal issues.
Yeah, it was primarily an attempt to deal with crime. So any kind of crime can be responded towards with like vigilante justice in Guatemala, whether it's relatively petty crimes and somebody shouting out like during so one of the places where lynchings often happen is at markets. Markets, because there's a large number of people there at any given moment in time. There's also like a higher number of people like potentially committing thefts or robberies. And so a call might go out at a particular market that somebody's stealing something from them, and then a crowd could descend upon them. But there are also other lynchings where it's a degree of organization is happening in the run up to the lynching, that a rumor has gone around that people are starting to identify potential criminals, and in that process of identification, a group gathers together and then they go and attempt to deal with the criminal themselves. So it can be anything between like a really spontaneous thing and a profoundly organized thing, but generally speaking, in relationship to an allegation of a crime. Now, those crimes don't necessarily have to fit with state understandings of justice. So sometimes it might be witchcraft allegations. In the case of one of the lynchings in Todos Santos, there was an allegation of Satanism. That sometimes it's about immorality that people think should be dealt with through a justice system, and yet it isn't. So it's justice oriented behavior, even if it doesn't fit directly with how justice systems perceive of justice.
Well, that's interesting. Just recently over the weekend in Derry, London, Derry, in Northern Ireland, apparently the IRA have been handing out letters to people who they think are having affairs, extramarital affairs, and they're policing that kind of behavior, telling people you've got to stop this or you've got to leave the person that you're cheating on. Um, is that a similar kind of idea?
Yeah, I mean, so there's an awful lot of things that happen that are quite vigilante-like, rather than just being straightforwardly vigilantism. So if you look online, for instance, practices such as doxing are quite close to vigilantism, in as much as it's seeing something that's deemed to be an immoral act and then dealing with it through something that is justice-like, in as much as distributing somebody's contact information, their address, their email address, their phone number. That's a way of dealing with it in an online community. And it's not necessarily vigilantism in the sense of using violence, but it's on the cusp of vigilantism. And that's what most vigilantism ends up being like, is something that's not straightforwardly always obviously vigilantism of there's an allegation of a crime and a group takes justice into their own hands. Often there's these things that are a little bit like just slightly separated. Like it's an idea that has like a hard core and fuzzy edges. And you see a lot of that in the way in which anthropologists look at terms, because they're often when we're thinking of language across cultures and ideas and ways in which we think about things across cultures, in trying to look at things on a global level, things won't necessarily fit nice and neatly into pre-established definitions, and vigilantism is one of these things. And so when something like these letters that you're talking about happen, it's quite it's quite a nice thing to, no, nice really isn't the word again. It's quite an interesting thing to think through, in as much as it's like vigilantism, but it's not necessarily vigilantism as we've encountered it before. But then that introduces these other spaces where it's the policing of behavior outside of the state, and it's people taking something that's slightly justice-like into their own hands. And these are the areas that we often like to think about in anthropology when we're thinking about ideas like justice and vigilantism. We don't expect there to be a perfect overlap between these categories on a global level, but it's where these things like slightly miss the center of that nice, straightforward definition that things become really interesting and worth thinking through a bit further.
So generally, vigilantism within anthropology is seen as having some relationship to the state, some relationship to citizens and criminality.
Yeah. So vigilantism is, like, at its most basic, most fundamental, it's a form of non-state justice. It's people taking justice into their own hands in the absence of state action. Almost always, it's more complicated than that. So in the case of Guatemala, if you're looking at lynchings, there is simultaneously people acting in the absence of the state, but there's also state agents using lynchings as a mask for their own non-authorized activities, which is like, it bleeds into death squads. There is people who used to be representatives of the state under, like, back when the population of Guatemala was militarized in civil patrol systems. It's people who used to patrol their own communities during the Civil War, carrying on patrolling their own communities after that authority has been taken away from them as the Civil War comes to an end. There's individuals who, after they've carried out a lynching, try and get it officiated through official recognition of it as being an act of community policing. And you've got all of these things going on in lynchings that bring it slightly closer to the state, even though we're thinking of the act as being like something that's in opposition to the state in its sort of most elementary level.
And we're talking about Guatemala there, but how prevalent are vigilantes across the world?
There's vigilantes in one way, shape, or form in most countries in the world in any given year. So if we take it at its broadest level, we can see, so this is not just vigilantism, but also vigilante-esque behavior. We can see communities taking justice into their own hands in many countries, but also we can see sort of online cyber patrolling of particular areas. We can see people policing Facebook communities. We can see people doxing. We can see people engaging in all kinds of vigilante-like behavior in most countries around the world, but also in new online communities. It's hard to... the United States clearly has vigilantes. Like right up until the present day, we can see people acting in vigilante-like ways in the UK right now, patrolling the coasts of Britain for looking for migrant boats coming in. We can see communities engaging in anti-paedophile actions here in the UK, where Facebook groups set up in order to sort of actively disclose the identity of alleged paedophiles in their community. And this is happening in countries where we have relatively well-functioning police at the moment. And so the further away you go from like there being a sense of organized, well-functioning police forces, the more you'll see vigilantes like emerging. And so this is why you see them in most countries around the world, because they spring up to meet perceived deficiencies in the state-based policing.
And do they change their character then in relation to that level of state competency around justice? So maybe in the UK and the US, we've got just about good enough justice systems that maybe people don't feel the need to act out, say, lynchings, as you're talking about in Guatemala, but maybe in other places where the state isn't as strong or the criminal justice system's more corrupt, that people act out in different ways.
Absolutely. Yes. So what you often find with these vigilante-like behaviors in countries with relatively well-functioning police forces is that they have to fit in the gaps in between law and the perceived deficiencies. So a recent example of this is the anti-paedophile hunters here in the UK. So what ended up happening here in the UK is that there's a American TV series called To Catch a Predator. I think it's called To Catch a Predator. It's Catch a Predator or To Catch a Predator, which had a format whereby sting operations were set up where online contact was established between a individual pretending to be an underage person and somebody who was soliciting sex with them. And then when the individual turned up in the place, there was then an arrest made of that individual, and they were like a TV episode broadcast this individual coming into a house and having a conversation with the broadcaster.
And that was real life?
That was real life, and
Yeah.
it really existed. But that's the model that got adopted by paedophile hunters in like the democratized world of social media and YouTube. So individuals started to set up the very similar sting operations where they would then meet up with the individual in a public place, say a car park or somewhere else where they could then film the encounter. And then they then shared all of that information onto YouTube at the same time as giving this documented evidence to the police. So they were forcing the hands of the police at the same time as they were disclosing publicly what this person had solicited. So you end up in this situation where it's not vigilantism in the sense that these individuals are using violence, but they are definitely taking justice into their own hands. But what you started to see happening was that they became more and more sophisticated about what they could and couldn't do if they wanted these individuals to be arrested, to the point where it started to have a visible impact upon the number of people who were being arrested for soliciting minors. And this came down to the fact that the British police force isn't allowed to engage in entrapment. The British police force isn't allowed to pretend to be somebody to entice somebody into a criminal act. But at the same time, the British public are. So they were exploiting a space where the British police couldn't act at the same time as being told not to do that because it was potentially dangerous for themselves. It potentially, in some instances, it led to violence being brought upon the person who they were entrapping. That all of these things were simultaneously going on. So it's not straightforwardly vigilantism because it actually ends up being in conjunction with the police force, even though it's clearly a group of people taking justice into their own hands. And this is often what you see happening with vigilante-like behavior, is that it has to fit in with the justice system in which it's taking part. So another example of that is there's a real-life superhero who works in Seattle called Phoenix Jones. And Phoenix Jones is part of a growing movement of self-described real-life superheroes, individuals who dress up in superhero costumes and either act in patrolling crime, but many of them just engage in, many of these real-life superheroes don't engage in criminal patrols. They just go and help out in homeless shelters. or go to hospitals and talk to children and do lots of other very good things. But there is some of them who do engage in citizen-based policing. And here's a really good example of that. Here's somebody who goes out and actively polices crime hotspots in Seattle. And I was, due to my interest in vigilantism, at one stage I ended up sharing a stage with him, having a conversation, and he went into detail about the way in which he has to, in order to fit in with American legislation, because he is not allowed to attack a person who he thinks has committed a crime without without proper permission. What's the word? So he needs one of two things to happen. He needs either the person to have thrown a punch at him or tried to harm him first, or to have received permission from the person who was the victim of crime for him to pursue that individual who was alleged to have committed the crime. So in order to carry out something that is not quite vigilantism, in order to not be a vigilante, in order to make sure that he fits in with the justice system, he has to very carefully moderate his behavior so that he isn't committing a crime, so that he isn't personally...
But he's trying to not actually be a vigilante.
Yes, so he's actively trying not to be a vigilante while taking justice into his own hands in the absence of the police. So you end up in this really weird space where, because there is a fully functioning police force there, that it is obviously imperfect, that is obviously has all of the flaws that are being exposed in the United States right now, but because it is functioning to the extent where he could also be arrested and he could be taken to court and he could get into trouble, he has to act in a very, very well described space in between laws where he is able to carry out something that is vigilante-like but not vigilantism.
What is it that makes vigilantes a problem? There's maybe people that are going to be listening to that and thinking, well, if he's filling a gap that, maybe there are particular crimes, particular areas that the police aren't active enough in, don't have the resources to cover what's wrong with people, either as individuals or coming together, because this isn't something that's all that far away from something like Neighborhood Watch.
No, and I have a lot of sympathy with many vigilantes. There are many reasons to carry out vigilantism. When it's about a deficiency in justice and a need to police your own community, make sure that everybody feels safe, it's very easy to be on the side of vigilantes and people engaging in vigilante-like behavior. Now, in regards to Phoenix Jones, that day when I got to meet him and share a stage with him and have a conversation with him, there was a British police officer in the audience who was at the time writing a biography of Phoenix Jones, who was a huge fan of Phoenix Jones and pointed towards the fact that crime had notably sort of measurably gone down in the areas where Phoenix Jones policed, because the last thing that you need if you're carrying out any level of criminal behavior in a particular area is not just a real life superhero bugging you and trying to arrest you, but like a group of people with cameras following that individual and making that area that is like perhaps a little bit more furtive, perhaps a little bit more secretive, making that suddenly public and broadcast. And crime went down in the areas where he was carrying out his patrols. And if you're seeing somebody taking justice into their own hands, having a visible impact in diminishing of crime in that area, then clearly there's something positive being done. And then you've got cases all the way through to, say, the Rondas Campesinos in Peru, where it's in sort of remote, rural Andean communities where there is no real police presence, but where there is crime, and you see these communities join together to form these rondas, these patrolling groups, who then go out and patrol their own communities and bring about justice, bring about a sense of policing, bring about a sense of justice. It's not the state, but they're filling in for the state, and they're doing something that their communities see as being beneficial. And in cases like these, I think it's quite hard to be on the side of like the state. The state is being deficient. The vigilantes are doing a good job. It's only where sort of aspects of what we might think of as being those things that are parts of better functioning justice systems. It's only when those aspects are missing where it starts to become more problematic. So, for instance, in the lynchings that happened in Todos Santos, where I carried out my research, in both cases, there wasn't really any space to assess the evidence about what these individuals were being accused of. And so, in avoiding due process, in avoiding a court based system, individuals who were accused of wrongdoings were attacked and they weren't given the opportunity to prove their innocence. And as a result, 2 people died in the first attack, and in the second, an individual was hospitalized. And in neither of those cases was there an opportunity that is provided within a court-based proceeding or within sort of a proper, fully functioning police system for evidence to be properly gathered, for evidence to be weighed and measured by a court. None of those things were there because it was something that was much more spontaneous, because it was something that didn't work in the same way as a fully functioning police and judicial system. Now, as an anthropologist, I'm not saying that the state is the only way of doing justice. I'm not saying that a police and a judiciary and a court-based system is the intrinsic way in which justice or justice-like behavior plays out. It's just that some forms of vigilantism, particularly those that are more spontaneous, often carry with them a lack of attention to detail in establishing people's guilt properly, which could be built into vigilantism, which could be built into non-state justice. It's just that the more spontaneous it is, the more these flaws can be magnified and expanded. So that's where my sympathies lie and don't lie with vigilantes. So sometimes the things that they're demanding are also phenomenally problematic. Like if you look at vigilantism, like in the context of lynchings in the southern United States over the last century, there it's the issue that sort of issues of race are mapped onto understandings of justice, and vigilantism can become profoundly racist in those contexts. In other contexts, it can take on religious elements. In other contexts, it can take on all kinds of problematic aspects where it's not about justice as I would see it, or as many would see it. It's about implementing the political desires or the racist or Islamophobic policies of a particular group. And that's another problem with vigilantism and the way in which it's a flexible category that sort of has the ability to take on these other aspects.
So, are there examples of forms of vigilantism where they have something like due process, that they pay more attention to these details? They have consideration of what's the evidence that makes someone guilty, or even those wider issues of, that a good judicial system will cover, like what do we do to support a victim? What do we do to support witnesses? How do we provide some form of like reparation to the community? Those kind of ideals that we have, in UK and American justice.
Yes. I mean, so by the time that starts to enter into systems of vigilantism, you're looking at it starting to become something that's more of a parallel justice system. And in places such as Peru with the Rondas Campesinos, or even in some communities in Guatemala where they have organized vigilante patrols, that's starting to become the case. So once patrollers are starting to organize, all they need to do is build in sort of small caveats into their processes. So if instead of just using violence directly against somebody, they bring the individual who's being accused back to community elders or back to like the town square for like any evidence to be heard. By the time they've built in these caveats, it's starting to look a lot more like a functioning justice system, or something that is justice-like, as opposed to something that is entirely vigilante and about the state. What you're starting to see there is something that's more like a parallel justice system. And so that's again where the sort of hard core and the fuzzy edges of vigilantism come into play. It's the way in which all it takes is a little bit of organization. All it takes is a little bit of a sense of proportionality, and it starts to transform the actions of vigilantes away from just being about revenge, and it can start to become about restitution. It can start to become about other forms of justice. So yeah, restitution. Like if upon taking an individual to community elders, or taking an individual to have their case heard in sort of a town square or something similar, if at that stage, rather than everybody clamoring for the person to be attacked with violence, they start to ask for something more subtle or something more measured, then we're into the realms of something that is more about community justice, popular justice, something where the word justice needs including. And it's not that vigilantism doesn't include those things. It's just that as soon as we start to get to something that does think those things through, it is something slightly intrinsically more organized and is part of an emerging system that might be running in parallel to a state.
Do those forms of vigilantes then occur in the context of places where there are alternative sorry do those forms of vigilantism then occur where there are alternative political structures that are growing or developing, that are challenging the orthodox structures at that time and place?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. So particularly areas where there's a fractured state and there's less centralization of power, and you will often see this in areas where there is rural populations without sort of recurrent access to state representation. So often in countries in Latin America, what you see is that governments don't particularly care that much about the running of rural areas in between elections. At times of elections, all of a sudden you'll see politicians emerge and make their presence felt quite strongly. But in between those elections, low-level sort of representatives of the state will tend to act in a slightly more clientelist way. They will start to serve those people that voted for them or who they want to vote for them, rather than the communities as a whole. And in those areas in particular, not just in Latin America, but around the world, we might think of those areas being sort of the margins of the state, not literally in as much as they're on the edges of the state, but they're these areas which have a different relationship to those people who live in cities, those people who live in areas where the state is very apparent. In these more marginalized communities, alternative systems might make much more sense. They might make much more sense in many ways. It might be that they can deal with things more immediately, rather than having to deal with things through going to see police forces who are sort of hours away. So in Todos Santos, the nearest police station prior to the arrival of the Civil National Police in the community, which happened in the aftermath of the lynching, the nearest way in which you could get hold of the police at the time when the lynchings occurred was actually to go to the military barracks, which were at the time 3 hours away. So dealing with anything to do with policing immediately just wasn't an issue. And also, these things were not just remote in terms of geography, they were also remote in terms of language. So it was a community where most people spoke Mam, which is sort of a Mayan indigenous language, whereas the language of justice in Guatemala was Spanish. So there's a linguistic gap there. So people taking justice into their own hands often made a lot more sense than relying upon a state that had been actively hostile to them throughout 36 years of civil war, who hadn't really done anything to show them that there was a new, fully functioning police force that worked. And so you see that happening in Guatemala, but you see very similar things happening throughout Latin America as many civil wars sort of came to an end at the end of the Cold War. So civil wars like from Colombia, Peru, El Salvador, Honduras, that the end of the Cold War led to a change in relationship between states and citizens. And in all of these places, you saw an absence of a fully functioning justice system that was frequently being filled in these places by other groups, whether they're gangs or vigilantes, but the vacuum for people dealing with issues on a local level was immense. And so seeing parallel systems emerging is a very frequent experience in these countries.
So if you're very far away from where justice is, from where police operate, or they operate justice in a language that isn't yours, it actually makes a lot of sense to, or not even that it makes sense, there's maybe a real practical need for you to try to create your own justice.
Absolutely. And it's something you see all around the world. It's something um, you'll see in any communities where there is a perceived absence of justice, where people don't trust the state to do what they expect them to do, or where there is no resources for the state to do that, then communities taking justice into their own hands is what you'll see. Now, sometimes that looks really disorganized and spontaneous and anarchic, and well, no, anarchic in the sort of Hobbesian sense of anarchism. It will look disorganized and it will emerge in a very ad hoc way. But the longer that goes on, the greater the propensity of communities to start organizing around that and to start producing something that does contain slight like a sense of subtlety about how to deal with criminals, a sense of proportionality, a sense of what is due process within a particular community. The longer it goes that communities have to self-police them, the more it looks like a police force as you'll see it in other countries.
Quite early on, you mentioned an interest in media representations of vigilantes. And all the way through this conversation, I keep thinking about comic book characters, Batman and Commissioner Gordon. At one point, I was really particularly thinking about when you were talking about examples of vigilantes that were more linked to the state, or where they had some level of police support. Um, and you actually have a really interesting paper that essentially asks the question, given our love of comic books and the prevalence of vigilantes in comic books, why do we not actually not have more vigilantes in the world?
Yeah, so this is something that came about through the work of Ray Abraham. So Ray Abraham is a Cambridge-based anthropologist who's now quite long retired, but he introduced the idea of vigilantism as being sort of an object of anthropological study. And in his research, he argued that vigilantism was a frontier phenomenon, that vigilantism is something that happens in the margins of the state, in these areas where sort of the prevalence of the state and the visibility of the state starts to break down, that in these frontier spaces, vigilantism emerges. But when it emerges, it needs three different factors to be met in order for it to properly take hold and to start to spread. And these factors are: one, you need a dissatisfaction with the justice system; two, you need experience and awareness of vigilantes elsewhere; and three, you need a blueprint for vigilantism as a thing that you can copy. And so for me, two and three there, like experience and awareness of vigilantes and something to copy, can be fused down into one thing. So what you need is dissatisfaction with justice and something to copy. And while I was writing about Guatemalan vigilantes, I was seeing this as a thing. I was seeing that Guatemalan vigilantism in part spread because people became more aware of vigilantism in other communities. They became more aware of the fact that other people were taking justice into their own hands by hearing about it on the radio and reading about it in newspapers, and that leads communities to taking it into their own hands. And you can see this going on all around the world, that wherever there is vigilantism and it's being covered by the media, you see it spreading. And while I was watching the film Kick-Ass, or was I read that? Yeah, I think I watched the film Kick-Ass before I read the comic book Kick-Ass, but both of them are very good media representations. Mark Miller is a really good comic book writer. Like, if you want to read people writing comics where ideas of justice are being explored and looked at in relation to state and policing and the military, he's a really good writer. And in Kick-Ass, he gets right to the center. And it's about a character in the comic book who wonders why there's not more people copying the comic book characters, the superheroes that they're reading about. And in the film, it asks the same question, like, why isn't there more vigilantes if there is such a rich vein of media to be copied? And this fitted with everything I was seeing in vigilantism. Vigilantism is something that spreads through the media. And why, if we've got this rich media of vigilantism, is it not more abundant in the United Kingdom or in the United States or in countries where this media is broadly consumed? And so I wrote an article that explored this, and the answer I came up with is that there is a functioning justice system, and therefore that there is less dissatisfaction with the justice system, and so there's less of a need of it. And also that the media that we have that is exploring vigilantism isn't necessarily entirely pro-vigilantism. That Batman is a really ambiguous story. Like in throughout the Black Lives Matter protests and throughout sort of the active movements against the United States police force that we're seeing at the moment, there's an awful lot of like memes being shared online about Batman being a cop, or about Batman being sort of pro-capitalist, or about Batman having this problematic background, because it's not saying he's a hero to be held aloft. The comic books aren't just about representing him as an unambiguous hero. Actually, what's going on in Batman comics is a lot more ambiguous, and there's an awful lot of discussion about what justice is, what policing is, what vigilantism is, and it all gets sort of unpicked. So between these two factors, between the prevalence of, between sort of the police force doing a better job than in some other places, and the message being put out by comic books being and films being more nuanced and less sort of gung-ho in its advocacy of vigilantism, that was my answer, that these are the reasons why it's not spreading. And then within weeks of me publishing the article, you started to see a bunch of press attention on Phoenix Jones at first, but then of a wider real-life superheroes movement where people were actively copying these vigilante superheroes. And so it's an article that came up with an answer, and then society then showed me to be wrong, which was really interesting. That actually what you see going on is, again, more complicated. That there is dissatisfaction with justice, but with a functioning police force, you have to have these individuals like Phoenix Jones who find a space in between the laws in which they can act. They have to find sort of a space where they can do something that does address this absence of justice, but it's in a slightly more nuanced way. And you have other individuals who copy like comic book and film superheroes, but they do so in other ways, such as going to hospitals and visiting sick children, giving out food to the homeless, that they engage with sort of good-spiritedness while dressed as heroes in order to do something else that it is that superheroes do. There is in the Tokyo subway, there is an individual who dresses up as a Power Ranger who calls himself Good Deed Ranger, who goes about just helping people on the subway while dressed as a Power Ranger. That's a perfect example of like how just because something's not being copied in a way that is straightforward vigilante-like, it's not that these real-life superheroes aren't. I mean, they do exist, and they are doing something coherent. It's just it's not straightforwardly vigilante in a way that we might expect. It's often more subtle, it's often directing their efforts into other areas. There is clearly an archetype that is being copied, but it's being copied in a way that has to fit within the system in which it's occurring.
Do you think they're being inspired by the comic book characters?
Oh, absolutely. So Phoenix Jones openly said that it was like Batman and Night Owl from The Watchmen that inspired him to like go out into the streets wearing a mask and fighting crime. Like he is openly taken that like upon him, and people who have been inspired by him are equally inspired by him as an individual and by their own favorite superheroes and by Power Rangers and by other individuals. That people look towards things that they respect and engage with and then copy the elements that they like, and that's exactly what you're seeing going on in the real life superheroes movement.
Are there differences between comic book vigilantes and superheroes and those in real life? I mean, I guess some of those people there we're talking about are really kind of blurring those boundaries, acting as if they are superheroes. But generally, is do you think comic books depict vigilantism in to some extent an accurate way?
So different comic books, different answers. So
Mm.
some comic books deal with like the issue of vigilantism and the engagement of superpowered beings in justice in a very unproblematic way, whereas others go deep into like the guilt of killing. They go into proportionality. They go into what like ideas of what justice looks like, and it depends upon the story and it depends upon the writer. So some of them are really nuanced in that, and then others just represent it as being something that is uh, mythological. It's just people like with superpowers doing good. So that's one area where the parallels between real life and comic book vigilantes it differs. That like all real life vigilantes have to deal with the sort of gritty reality of the real world, whereas some superheroes don't. The other obvious difference is they're not super in their heroism, that they don't really have superpowers. So um, Phoenix Jones wears a quite elaborate stab vest and sort of like some body armor is on the go, but it's a far cry from sort of there being built in rocket boosters in his feet like Iron Man, or from like him having batarangs or anything like that. It's body armor is about the extent of like how these individuals are able to sort of make themselves invulnerable. So there is no superness, and the reality in which they engage is a lot more gritty and real. So the end effect is often a lot more ambiguous. So often what you'll see is that the individuals who are engaged in sort of real life superhero vigilanteism and who actively want to engage in fighting crime on the streets have a quite limited shelf life, that either they have to sort of retreat from the eye of the public like once they start to get too much attention, or they'll get told off by the police and then they'll have to retreat back. So not too long ago, a couple of years ago, near to where I live, there was an individual referred to in the press as Bromley Batman, and he burnt brightly in the newspapers for about a month and then had to like recede back into privacy, because it's not something that you can really sustain for long, because you're going to get in trouble either with the police or with the people that you're attacking at some stage. And that's the slightly grittier reality of people engaging with crime and perceived deviance and taking justice into their own hands, that they have to do so against a backdrop of a pre-existing law and order structure that perhaps those in comic books don't have to.
What do you see as being the best comic book representation of vigilantes?
So I really like The Watchmen, just in terms
Yeah.
of it being a story that explores what taking justice into your own hands can look like in all of its different forms. You've got individuals who are clearly just outright vigilantes like Rorschach, who takes justice into his own hands, uses violence, and provides retributive justice against those people he perceives as being on the wrong side of the law, all the way through to individuals who, uh, spoiler alert, want to shape the entirety of the world by carrying out sort of massive acts of I don't want to spoil it too much. So spoiler alert, but not too big a spoiler, who have plans to do really bad things, but for long-term good. And between those two sort of ends of the spectrum, where you've got like people with long-term plans who are taking justice into their own hands in with a really long-term plan on their mind, through to people who spontaneously use sort of very physical violence to remedy things right there, right then. That's like, yeah, that's the whole spectrum of justice and non-state justice. And then you've got people working on behalf, like vigilantes working on behalf of the state. So you've got Dr. Manhattan. Dr. Manhattan sort of is the Superman type character, somebody who starts to work on behalf of the state and like starts to perform like military type interventions. That's the other side of people taking justice into their own hands, is that often if they're really good at it, or if they're better at it than the police force themselves, they will get co-opted by the state. And this is something you see in real life vigilantes. So the classic example of this is the Bakassi boys in Nigeria, who were a local area group, which was essentially a group of young men who started to actively police their own community, who started to actively try and reduce crime in their particular community, sort of on the cusp of slightly gang-like behavior, but with widespread benefits for those people living in the community who saw a decrease in crime. But because they then started to become seen as being better at justice, better at policing, better at doing what the police ought to have been doing, they slowly started to gain not just sort of widespread local support, but they started to be co-opted by the police themselves, and eventually were brought in to become sort of semi-official police forces within their particular areas. And that's sort of, it's these discussions of what happens in vigilantism that you can see playing out in the comic books like The Watchmen, or you can see playing out in sort of Mark Millar's work. You can see these discussions of justice, what it might look like, what the pitfalls are, like ideas of like just the question, who will watch The Watchmen that's in The Watchmen? Like, if you take justice into your own hands, who's going to be regulating you? These are all questions that can be applied to vigilantes, but also equally can be applied to the police. So in the United States, all of the current ideas of defunding the police, if you sort of delve down into what's being argued there, it's questions about like the regulation of the police force in the United States has utterly failed, that they can act with impunity in regards to everything right up to and including fatal violence against innocent citizens. And if there is nobody who is punishing those individuals for that, who will watch The Watchmen? Like, what is the consequence of just allowing this unfettered power? So you have all of these questions being asked within comic books about vigilantism, but equally they can be applied to wider understandings of justice. And so that's why I love many comic books that are exploring these areas, because they are asking really big questions about justice.
And big questions that we seem to have been really fascinated with over long periods of time.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, so comic books are really good at some things. They're really good at sort of providing a window into escapism and sort of letting people deal with alienation and a sense of sort of not quite belonging. So comic books like the X-Men or Spider-Man, where you get special powers that allow you to escape like the overwhelming nature of city life, or allow you to explore ideas of like feeling really other to the rest of society. They're really good at exploring those things. And they're also really good at exploring issues of justice. They're less good at exploring things like mental health. They're less good at exploring inequality. They're less good at exploring sort of some other aspects of like social ills of the world. But those things that they are good at exploring, they do so very well, because there's like 100 years of history of superhero comic books exploring these areas, and they've managed to get to a stage where the questions they're asking are pretty pertinent to contemporary society.
And any bit of art can't cover absolutely everything all in one go.
No, and also they're trying to like draw you in. They're trying to tell a story. They're trying to deal with these other things, but because superheroes are quite an open cipher, you can sort of project quite detailed, relevant stories onto them if that's what you want to do. And you can see that with the current Watchmen TV series, that it takes 2019, 2020, like it takes that like a very, very contemporary world, but then looks at superheroes today in relation to the history of the Watchmen comic book, but also in relation to like American racial politics. And it then comes up with like some really quite powerful points about policing and racial politics and the state in contemporary America, because it uses that empty cipher and then projects all of these ideas into that sort of area. And it's really like provocative and really evocative of what's going on in discussions about American politics and like the rise of like the far right and the rise of like Black Lives Matters. It's all going on there in what should, in one sense, be like a fluffy comic book superhero thing, but then actually as it plays out, it's got like big things to say.
Gavin, I'm having to be really strict with myself and try to keep these episodes down to a certain length of time, or else I could keep going on talking about this.
No problem.
But that's been absolutely fascinating. Thanks very much for your time. Do you want to tell people about where they can find out more about your work?
Now I'll leave it at that rather than selling myself. Do I want to sell myself? No. People,
it
if
never
people are interested,
hurts. Someone has to.
no, if people want to find my book, I'm sure they can find it themselves. Yeah. No.
Gavin, that's very humble of you. Thanks again.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode. Remember to rate and review the show on your podcast app to help us get noticed. And you can get in touch on Twitter or through the website. Bye for now.
Curiosity Cake.